Welcome, everyone. My name is Margaret Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of the Trumpeter Swan Society. And I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today, Tracking Midwest Swans. I'm pretty excited about this presentation. And before we get started, I just want to let you know that the webinar is being recorded. So in a couple days, you will receive through Zoom the link to the recording. You are muted and your video is turned off. We'd love to have your questions, but please put them in the Q&A box on your screen. Normally it's at the bottom of your screen. And at the very end, when you close your browser at the very end of the webinar, we do have a very short survey, which is extremely important for us to know what your thoughts are and that kind of thing. And it's just a pleasure to be able to welcome you. So before we get started, I also want to introduce some people from the Trumpeter Swan Society that'll be helping us. Jim Hawkins is from the Yukon, and if you were at our Yukon webinar, he was one of the presenters for that. He's on our education committee. Tiffany Mayo is the chair of our education committee, and she's from Ohio and is pretty much in charge of the trumpeter swans at the zoos, and certainly in terms of their breeding and the cygnets that hatch. And then we also have Jeff Nelson, who is the president of the board of the Trumpeter Swan Society. And Jeff, would you like to say a few things about what the Trumpeter Swan Society does, please?
Sure. Thanks, Margaret. First, I want to say thank you to everyone for attending. We always get really good feedback from these webinars, and we appreciate you taking the time to get online with us. The Trumpeter Swan Society has been around for over 50 years now, and it's really a small nonprofit focused on restoring trumpeters across as much of their historic range as possible. And we do this through a variety of ways, through conservation education programs, but always in partnership with other groups. We started off just with trying to restore swans, really by moving eggs and into Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan and those areas to try to get the populations established back in the 60s and 70s. Since then, swans have obviously been very successfully expanding their populations now. And so we've focused, in addition to all the restoration work we do, on education through webinars and swan conferences and through YouTube and other means, such as what we're doing today. We also work on outreach through another variety of programs, including film projects and through social media, et cetera. We at times take advocacy positions with other groups on key policy issues that might affect the ability of swans to thrive and to continue to expand their range. We do some monitoring of swan health through power line collision monitoring, lead poisoning monitoring, and try to educate industry and the public as to how to ameliorate some of those negative impacts. And then finally, and this is what we're going to hear about today, we do fund some research projects, and we think it's really important to be science-based. And so we've taken an approach to working with universities across the country on various projects that are underway to try to understand how swans function in their habitats and how to better promote their continued expansion. And so we have a variety of things we work on, and we're really a small, effective board, but we and rely totally on people being interested in swans and continue to support the organization. So again, thanks a lot for being a part of this webinar today.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. And today we're going to hear from David Wolfson, who was the main project leader for the Midwest Swan Tracking Project, which was really the largest tracking project that's ever been done for Midwest swans. And obviously the Trumpeter Swan Society was pretty proud and pleased to be able to be part of that. And it's going to be pretty exciting to hear the findings, the big picture findings that David found. And he can talk a little bit about that. And then it'll be followed by some stories of individual swans in that GPS tracking study that came in through Trumpeter Watch. So David, you want to take it away?
All right, thanks, Margaret. Thanks everyone for being here. So, yeah, I'm going to be talking about migration and some ecotoxicology of trumpeter swans in the Midwest. I'm currently a postdoc at the University of Minnesota, and I just want to acknowledge the other two kind of leads on this project, David Anderson, who is now retired, but formerly with USGS and the Minnesota Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit, and then John Feeberg, a professor at the University of Minnesota. So to kind of give you a roadmap here, this was work that was my PhD project, and I'm going to first sort of try and set the stage for why the project was initiated in the first place, talk about the history of trumpeter swans in the Midwest, their decline, and then their subsequent reintroduction and comeback. And then the two sort of topics I'm going to be focusing on today are migration patterns of these birds and then the effects of lead or toxicology. So a little bit about the biology of trumpeter swans first. They're the largest waterfowl species. They have long necks and strong legs, and that kind of guides the way that they forage on submerged aquatic vegetation. They can kind of root up submerged plants with those strong legs and nails on the feet and then eat it. And they are very long-lived, 20 plus years in the wild, and form monogamous pair bonds. And it really helps you if you're going to live a long time to invest in your partner and invest in one place that you're going to come back to year after year. So they form these territories and then they could repeatedly come to them year after year. So you can see here sort of what swans need is vegetation. They need cover from predators. And then they'll also need material to build nests for their young. So this is sort of like a typical good-looking swan habitat. You've got a mix of cover, you've got the right plants, and then shallow vegetation as well is required for them to have ideal conditions. So kind of a neat thing about swans is they're such big birds, super heavy, that they take a lot of space to kind of get up and in the air and take off. And they use these big feet as kind of landing gear to get up and going. So they'll run across the water, but then also to land to kind of put them out like big landing pads. And one kind of interesting tidbit about swans is a lot of birds will, when they create a nest, they'll pluck downy feathers from their chest as an insulating material for the eggs. And what trumpeter swans do is they pick those big feet with tons of blood vessels just right over the eggs, and then they can directly transfer heat to the eggs that way. So there's not great information about where trumpeter swans were historically, but it's believed that they were sort of across the majority of North America, especially more towards Canada and in the boreal areas. However, once sort of European settlement and colonization took place, market hunting really kind of took off and swans were taken in really large numbers, as well as other waterfowl species. What you see here in the picture on the right, this is called a punt gun, where you basically blast an entire cloud of shot and you can take down tons and tons of birds at a time. So there was no limits to how many birds people could harvest, and that had really big negative impacts on waterfowl. As well, there was demand for products from birds, and so women's hats were very popular for a short time, using feathers directly from birds killed in the wild. And then also, yeah, so this is from one of the first satirical publications, and it's showing a woman collecting bird feathers for the millinery trade. This is from the early 1900s. And then also, there are other products too. So people would use trumpeter swan feathers for pens. Audubon himself said swans were his favorite bird to use as feathers for illustration. And then powder puffs for women's makeup. The downy feathers provided ideal materials for that. So to kind of give you a roadmap in time now, so they were historically relatively widespread. However, sort of at their low point in the lower 48, there was down to only one population left in this sort of area between Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. Um, and that was sort of the last bastion of trumpeter swans. They eventually created a refuge to protect swans there at Red Rock Lakes National Wildlife Refuge. And that was successful in sort of raising those numbers. In 1959, some pilots in Alaska discovered or rediscovered that there were a large population of Alaskan swans up there as well. And so that actually led to swans being reintroduced into their historic breeding range in the Midwest. And so the first such transfer was directly from the Red Rock Lakes area to the High Plains flock, sort of on the border of South Dakota and Nebraska. But then after those Alaskan birds were found, efforts really ramped up in the 80s and 90s, where biologists went directly to Alaska and took eggs from nests and then started to try and fill in places in the Midwest where trumpeter swans were historically. This continued into the early 2000s, and more states started their own sort of independent reintroduction programs, including Iowa and Ohio. Initially, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota and Ontario as well grabbed eggs, and then yeah, things continued to develop. And so swans are sort of divided into these three populations, the Pacific coast, the Rocky Mountain, and the interior. And so today we'll be focusing on swans in the kind of greater Midwest area, also known as the interior population. And so these red arrows show sort of where swans were used to take to other places. And those red stars are kind of like the sources for where the reintroductions came from. So there was a big mix of how swans were brought back to the Midwest. There were a big number of eggs taken from Alaska, but there were also significant numbers of swans taken directly from the Red Rock Lakes area, and then also a lot from zoos and private breeders. So one distinction I want to make is that in Alaska, those were swans that would traditionally fly down to British Columbia in the Pacific Northwest in the winter and then return to Alaska in the summer. So they had a migratory tradition, whereas swans that were in that Red Rock Lakes area of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, those had lost their migratory habits. And then swans that were in zoos and on private breeder property, obviously those weren't migrating either. So you kind of get this mix of swans with different history, and you're putting them together now in a new place. And so in terms of the abundance of interior population swans, it had a slow start, but it's really ramped up quickly in the last, 30 years. And there's not wonderful abundance estimates currently, but based on sort of different state efforts and trying to get the best guesses we have, likely this population is over 50,000, which is great. So today, I'm going to be talking about some efforts to kind of focus in on a couple themes of this relatively recently reintroduced population, looking at what are the current migratory patterns we're seeing, and then also what is the effect of lead. And both of these will be taking kind of like a bigger population level perspective. So first, because we wanted to know where swans were and traveled to throughout the year, we needed to catch them and put transmitters on them. So the way that you can do that is that they'll actually molt all of their primary flight feathers all at once during the summer. And so at that time, they're unable to fly. We use a lot of different techniques to get to swans, airboats, canoes, flat bottom john boats, but basically anywhere you could get around in a shallow wetland, if you found a swan that was within molt, then it was logistically feasible to capture it. So once we had swans in hand, we took blood, and this was to test them for their lead levels, and then also to do some genetics that I won't have time to talk about today. And then we also put a GPS collar on them. And so you can see a picture of that here. The way that these work, it's basically getting a signal from a satellite every 15 minutes to triangulate where the swan is. And then once a day, that information gets relayed through a cell phone tower, just like your phones use. And then that gets passed to the database through that cell phone network. So we got a lot. Initially, this was a project that was just going to be in Minnesota with a much smaller sample size, but then we reached out to a lot of partners and added a whole bunch of different states in the province. And so increased the amount of swans we were able to study, which was great. And all in all, we put out 113 collars. And so the states that were added were Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Arkansas, and then Manitoba as well. And so this was over the course of about 3 years that swans were collared. This figure sort of shows state by state how many collars were deployed. So when you see color, that's information coming in from a specific swan. So Michigan, we had 14. These gray bars are the deployment periods in time. And so the first summer, it was just a handful of birds in Minnesota and Michigan. And this was kind of the pilot year to test capture techniques, to test the collars, see how well they worked. It actually turned out that there was an issue where water was getting in. And so we kind of went back and talked to the manufacturer, and they redid how they were building their interior housing. And then the next design worked much better. And so the next year, the summer of 2020, that's when most of these states joined our efforts. And so really appreciative to all the other states for actually buying a lot of these collars and then using their own staff to put out collars themselves. So it was a really great effort. And you can see there was a little bit more deployment in summer of 2021. These are from swans that had died and we were able to recover the collar and put it out on another bird. And then there was a little period in the winter of 2022 where we put out some collars specifically on those wintering in Arkansas to see where they were going to spend their summers. So for the migration topic, the main questions we had were, okay, so we know that there's a mix of reintroduction histories in terms of migratory habits. So it was thought that most of these interior swans don't migrate, but people hadn't really had a study to test this. And so we wanted to say, well, how many of these trumpeter swans actually do migrate or not? So what's the proportion that's migratory? And then also quantify the extent of that migration. So how far are they going? We also wanted to quantify the timing. So when are they leaving in the fall, coming back in the spring? And then see how all of those movement habits kind of correlated with their breeding status. So if you have young or cygnets or not. And then also where you're breeding. There may be differences in how you're migrating. So the way you can kind of describe annual movements of birds or any animals is something called net squared displacement. So what this is showing is you're basically, every dot is a point and you're saying, how far are you from a starting point in time? And so think about the bottom of this plot as time moving forward, and then the y-axis as how far are you moving from that starting point. And so for an animal that migrates, that you would start near the bottom, and then if, say, you migrated somewhere far away, you would then have dots that go up in value. Maybe you'd hit a plateau where you're sticking somewhere for the winter, and then you'd come back. And so this is sort of a good kind of schematic for how to describe the annual movements of an animal. So for the methods, the details don't matter. I'm going to try and have this be high level, but we basically, we used some statistics to say, where are there periods in time where your values of how far you are from that starting point are relatively similar to each other. And so what that's doing is it's picking out the different segments of how you're moving throughout the year. And so what that looks like, this is one of the swans from the study now. And so each black point is its displacement from that starting value. And so the starting points are all where we caught the swan during the summer. And then you can see the red dotted line, that is sort of what the model is fitting. And so it's showing that it can tell where it's breeding, the point in time when it leaves in the fall to migrate. You can see there's a few plateaus, and those might be staging areas. And then using the furthest plateau at the top, that's how far you're moving at any point in the winter. And then you can also see when you're coming back to your breeding territory in the spring. So this worked to kind of get the pieces of information that we wanted for this project. And so I'm going to sort of show the results in a few different ways now. So this is a busy plot, but one thing to kind of keep in mind is every point is the annual site is like 1 year for one swan. And so the x-axis on the bottom is showing the latitude where your breeding territory was, or for those that aren't breeding, where you were captured. And so all the way to the right is going to be further north, and all the way to the left is going to be further south. And then the y-axis is showing how far did you move throughout the year. So there's two colors. What do the colors mean? So there's basically kind of two strategies that it seemed swans were using based on this information. One was to have kind of a stable relationship between how far you're moving and how far north or south you're breeding. The other was to kind of stay local, not move far if you're at those southern locations, but then to migrate more if you're at northern latitudes. And so why there may be sort of two strategies and two groups, we're still kind of working on, but that was kind of some initial findings that came out. If you want to say, well, okay, that's great, but give me just like a real simple kind of clear grouping of how much did they migrate or not, you could say, if you took an arbitrary threshold, say 100 kilometers, then a little bit more than half of the trumpeter swans were moving that distance in the winter. 15% sort of had these smaller regional movements, maybe 25 to 100 kilometers, and about a fifth or 20% really didn't move much. They left their territory, but maybe only went less than 25 kilometers. And there was actually very little switching year to year from the same individual to different categories of those three. So to talk about timing a little bit, so that I was talking about distance in the last one, how far do they move? But this is talking about, well, when do they say leave their breeding territory? So the further north you bred, the earlier you would leave, which makes sense because winter comes sooner the further north you are. In the spring, the opposite was true. So the further north you bred, the later you're gonna get back, which makes sense as well because winter persists longer and spring comes later, the further north you go. And then so consequently, the amount of time you're spending away from your breeding territory is higher the further north you breed. Now, in terms of your breeding status, what I'm calling breeder, paired, and non-breeder. Breeder is when we caught you, we found young with you. Paired is you might have two adults that are, they're mates with each other, but there were no young, and so we don't know for sure. They may be younger than a successful breeding age. So swans typically don't have young until they're, say, 4 or 5 years old. And then these non-breeders are adults that are either failed breeders, but more likely they're too young to breed, and they're within big groups where you haven't maybe had established a pair, a mating pair yet. And so that's kind of the equivalent of kind of teenage swans learning how to become a swan, and you're hanging out with a bunch of other likewise individuals. So these breeders are leaving later in the autumn, which makes sense because you have to put time and energy into raising their young and letting them develop to the point where they're able to fly with you. Swans migrate together for the first year as a family group. And then if you're a non-breeder, you don't have that limitation of needing to take care of young, and so you're able to leave sooner. In the spring, breeders are coming back first because they need to get back and defend their territory from other swans, and then start building a nest and laying eggs and incubating. So there's a lot more kind of work to take care of. Non-breeders don't have that limitation. And then so they're spending different amounts of time away from the breeding territory based on these sort of breeding life history demands. Now, taking just like a real quick snapshot of where swans were during this is the first winter after we caught the majority of birds. And I just wanted to kind of think about, well, what are they doing and what kind of condition are they on? This was, I think, January. And so what you can see here is every dot is a collared swan. The yellow dots are where they're just on open water. It's not cold enough to freeze. That kind of green line is the approximate latitude of where ice is forming on bigger lakes. The green is actually rivers, which will freeze much later than ponds and lakes because there's moving water. And then purple is artificial open water. So what this is, it could be below a dam where there's kind of extra turbulence, or it could be a gravel quarry where they are washing rock and that's keeping water from freezing. Or a lot of people have bubblers or aerators in their lakes, and that's so that the fish don't die as much. So that's keeping water from freezing. And it seems in the winter, the two things swans really need are unfrozen open water and then access to food. So that was kind of like a really strong indicator of kind of wintering conditions. And some swans are able to kind of figure out, okay, here's unfrozen water. There's also places where people feed swans. And so if you've got food and open water, a lot of swans have realized they don't need to migrate further south than that. So some kind of like summary results are that overall, this is a population that has partial migration where some individuals migrate each year while others don't. There's a lot of variability among those behaviors and even among different parts of the study area. And that some of those differences in timing are likely due to parental care and then ice conditions near your breeding area. And rivers and artificial open water allow swans to kind of overwinter and kind of cheat migration in a way that they wouldn't be able to otherwise. So I'm gonna kind of switch gears here and now talk for the rest of the time about the effects of lead on swans. And so there's two ways that swans are ingesting lead. One is through hunting ammunition. And so it's no longer legal to hunt in wetlands with lead shot. However, there is sort of this like historical seedbed, you could think of it as lead from all the years where you could. And so that may be kind of trapped in sediment on the bottom, and swans can still disturb that, especially at low water levels. The other probably more significant way now is fishing tackle, which is still legal to use lead, unfortunately. And because swans have this muscular gizzard, they naturally will kind of ingest rocks. And so like these split shot sinkers are unfortunately just about the size of a rock that they might use. So the reason that they ingest rocks is because it kind of grinds up all this plant food in their gizzard. And so unfortunately, all it takes is a little bit of lead to have potentially really negative effects on birds. So one reason that we wanted to look at lead in the swans we were collaring is because there was kind of a gap in knowledge where it was really well known and well established that swans lead poisoning is like a significant negative kind of aspect for the population. However, most of the information we had that led to that was sort of things like you might see here. So swans had toxic lead levels. Okay. lead blame for swan deaths. Dozens of trumpeter swans die from lead poisoning. So like this is information from swans that have already ingested lead, are often taken into maybe wildlife rehab centers, and then often die or are in bad shape. So what we didn't have was some kind of like widespread baseline knowledge of, for the population in general, what is it like? Are they ingesting lead? How much is it causing problems? And so we kind of wanted to sort of fill in that gap a little bit with what we were doing with the rest of the project. So there's sort of good news and bad news. The bad news is that every swan we tested for lead had some amount of lead. The good news is that they were almost all sort of in the lowest level of vets kind of think about this as, well, are there clinical signs of lead poisoning or is it subclinical? And then there's this background category, which can be contentious depending on who you talk to, but that's where it's the lowest levels of lead in the blood. And so the majority of swans we tested were all in that background lead level, which is great. This is showing sort of every little tick in the line is a different individual tested. And so you can see the proportion of the total sample that's within each category. And so all the cygnets were in the background category, almost all of the adults. And then you can see there's just a handful that did have higher levels. And I want to kind of focus in on one that had the highest level here. So this is a swan. This is where it was captured, kind of like a backwater of the Mississippi River, Little White Oak Lake, which had a history of waterfowl hunting, is an active fishing spot. And so we caught a swan here. And this is what is next to it. This is a power plant, and with coal ash ponds that you can see. So they're about 3 miles away from each other. And when we caught the swan and tested it, it had high lead levels. And then also after the swan kind of regrew those flight feathers, it made repeated trips over to this power plant. It's a little unclear what drew it to the power plant, what it was getting there. This is during the summer, so there's open water all over. But it could be a coincidence, or it could potentially have picked up lead from these coal ash tailings. Unfortunately, it's really hard to pinpoint, one, how long lead stays in the bloodstream of wild birds. It can be kind of very variable, depending on a lot of things. And then also, it's hard to necessarily say, okay, this was lead from fishing tackle or from power plant stuff, unless you do a much more intensive kind of stable isotope type analysis, which we weren't set up to do that. Another thing about this bird is that it was fine, even though it had severe lead levels, and it actually flew quite far, all the way to Michigan, over the next 3 winters to winter. So kind of summing up this, all swans tested positive for lead. However, nearly all of them were in this kind of lower background category. None of the swans we caught were showing outward signs of negative impacts from lead. And sort of the last case scenario kind of illustrates how wildlife can kind of serve as bioindicators of the environment around, where maybe you pick up on something that you weren't even necessarily looking for, based on this information. Okay, and now kind of wrapping things up big picture. So this started as a much smaller effort, and then talking to different agencies and groups, we were able to build it into sort of more of a whole Midwest-wide effort, which is great because then we could kind of talk about the whole interior population in general. So we quantified these annual movement patterns and found that there's a whole bunch of variability, sort of tried to tease apart why we might see some of those differences based on breeding latitude and breeding status. And then kind of did some landscape level monitoring on lead within these wild trumpeter swan populations, seeing that it was present, but at typically quite low levels. So thank you so much to all the people that were part of this. There was tons and tons of people that helped out with swan capture, Thank you to those that have contributed swan sightings. And yeah, so I wanted to kind of like highlight there's just lots of agencies and organizations that were part of this. It was a really big group effort. And I'd be happy to kind of take any questions you have during the question and answer period. These are my kids, so yeah. Okay. All right. I'll stop.
Okay.
And then
So now it's my turn to share the smart. Okay, I'm gonna whoops. Yeah, well now it says not found, but let's just try it. Okay, you get, let's see if this shows up. Okay, you guys can see that, correct?
yep,
Everybody
looks
can see
good.
it? Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so this is Margaret Smith and from the Trumpeter Swan Society, and we have a program called Trumpeter Watch. And fortunately, and thanks to a lot of different people, we actually got reports, Trumpeter Watch reports, and photos and stories of some of the swans that came in that were part of this GPS tracking study. So I think David said there were 126 swans that received it. And we received 68 Trumpeter Watch reports of those GPS swans. And Iowa, we'll talk a little bit about that, but Iowa also put some green collars that are non-transmitting collars on some of the cygnets and some of their swan families where a parent had a GPS collar. So they put on 40 green collars on their cygnets, and we received reports of over half of them. So what's going to follow right now are some of the stories as reported through Trumpeter Watch. So David, this is pretty cool. So this is all on the tracking map. So David talked about that the swans that left in the north, left sooner and probably went, further where there were south. So we know this is Manitoba. And so these swans were captured up here, and you can see how far they travel. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So just keep in mind this map, because when we get to Michigan, you'll see it'll be a little bit different. So some of the reports that we got were actually of the swans migrating. So 3H, which was captured up in here, was reported. This is when she's migrating through Iowa, back up to Manitoba. And 9H, which was a male, we had Trumpeter Watch reports of it migrating back when it was flying through Iowa as well as Minnesota. So it's really pretty cool to get these reports and to actually see what the birds are and see the condition of the collars. And 1H is a male. This is another cool story. So 1H was collared in July of 2020, and by late September, it was reported in northern Minnesota. And David had talked about those northern birds leaving sooner, and obviously it's here with a mate. And so this was the first report that I got of one of these GPS birds, which was in September in northern Minnesota. And then later we'll see where it actually went down to Les Bluffs National Wildlife Refuge in Missouri. So it's pretty cool. Another Manitoba bird was 5H, and it was captured up here near Hecla Island. And that's a pretty great spot for seeing waterfowl up there. So that's where, you'll see trumpeter swans. And actually, this is where he spent the winter down here in Missouri. And this was 5H up there in Manitoba. Now, Minnesota is pretty interesting. We'll talk a little bit about this. So these are all those Minnesota birds. And then there was this one outlier that went way up here and over here. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And I got these maps from David, which was great. So this was the swan that went all the way up to Hudson Bay. And so this is 5L, who's a female, but she was the only cygnet that received in Minnesota that received a GPS collar. So her first summer, she spent her first summer here in Minnesota. She didn't leave for the winter and stayed with her parents. But the second, in June, which was when she was going to turn, she was a year old, what she did is then she headed up all the way up here to Hudson Bay area and spent the summer up here. And Trumpeter Swan Society isn't quite sure why they, because again, nobody was with her and there weren't any sightings. And so one of our guesses was that, well, maybe, maybe there was a flock of geese or something that was making a molt migration or going up there, and she just happened to go along. And then later she came down here, across Lake Superior over here into Michigan, and then flew this way. And then she spent the winter down here in Illinois. So altogether, this young bird between June of 2021 and November of 2021 traveled more than 2,400 miles. So that was really, a cool thing and sort of the outlier of the Minnesota birds. So now we'll take a look at some of these other birds in Minnesota. So you can see all these lines represent different birds. Here's that one that went up to Hudson Bay. So we're going to take a look at a few of these other Minnesota birds. Well, this was a cool story too. So this is one of the first ones that we got in the winter of 2020. So this bird, 8E, which was a male, was collared in northern Minnesota in 2020, July of 2020. But it flew down, we didn't know this, but it flew all the way down here to Heber Springs. So I actually got a call from some of our members down there in Heber Springs, and they said, we have this bird down here with a white collar, and it's, they took pictures. This was taken down here in Heber Springs, and, what is this bird? And that's where I called up David. I said, hey, I don't see the bird on the map. And he said, I haven't put it up yet. So he did give me information about that between November 29 and November 30, so it flew 700 miles straight in 12 hours, and it had an average speed of 55 miles per hour with a maximum speed of 75 miles per hour. So that was really cool, to find out the speed and the distance and that this bird traveled for 12 hours straight to get down to Arkansas. Then another cool story is another Minnesota bird, which is 8A. One of the purposes of the study was to see if swans made molt migrations. And this was one bird that we saw that did. It was a lone bird, and she actually had spent time up here in Minnesota. This is where she was captured and collared. And then that winter, she went down to Quincy, Illinois, so she was down there. And then she went back up here again. And then in August of 21, she was here in this remote area of Ontario. And here she is up there in Ontario. So Darren Williams took this picture up there in Minnesota, in Ontario, which is really cool. So that's a molt migration. You can kind of see these raggedy feathers there. And David had already brought this up, but this is Minnesota 4T that traveled across to near Kalamazoo, Michigan. And so Melanie Martin has submitted a number of Trumpeter Watch reports about 4T, and she wrote a little story for our Trumpeting's newsletter about this bird that had spent time here in Michigan. And what she had reported, this was last year, I think it was, there was a big ice storm in Michigan, and she said she hadn't been able to see that bird for about a week. And then Melanie went back to where the bird had been, and she didn't see her, so she went to the map. So thank goodness for David for, updating the map. And by the 23rd of February, she had flown across here, and, so within 4 days, she made it back here. And this is where she spent the summer. And this was the bird that David had said had the high lead levels. Here's 4T with her cygnets that year. Now we'll get to Iowa. So these birds are still moving south, but they're not moving north. And these are just some of the birds. So these are just showing some of the GPS collared birds. But later we'll talk about this 5C. Actually went to Les Bluffs, which is in Missouri right here. And then I just want to point out 1C. I don't have a picture of that bird, but this is the purple track that she followed. And the reason I bring this up is because the signet, I'll show you that, the signet of this bird was not with the parent, but was actually was actually up here with Les Bluffs. So it was really interesting where the signet didn't stay with the parents. Well, as I mentioned before, Iowa decided they wanted to see what the family movements were over the course of the first year. So they put collars, green collars on 40 of the cygnets. And so this is what they look like. Here's one of the GPS parents. Here are the green collars of the cygnets. And here's another GPS parent with one of the green collars. And so what Iowa did is they could see where the GPS swan was on the tracking map, and then they got volunteers at different places to go out and count how many green collared swans that they saw, so they could see, you know, if the birds were alive, the cygnets were alive. Well, interestingly enough, I also got reports of these green collared swans, and one of them was 6P4, and this was reported in Minnesota, so it didn't stay in Iowa. It went north to Minnesota and got sick. So these are actually suspected lead poisoning, and I think it probably died. Now, some of these other birds, the green collared cygnets, actually did not stay in Iowa, but moved north to Minnesota during their second year. So they didn't stay in Iowa for their home, but went up north to Minnesota for whatever reason. But I keep talking about Les Bluffs, which is a National Wildlife Refuge in Missouri. And this is where it is. These are all the GPS collared swans and their movements, but I just kind of want to show where Les Bluffs is, and they'll have a little bit closer up. So here's Les Bluffs, and you can see all these are the GPS swans that went to Les Bluffs. And it was really cool. We call it the swan meeting place because there were swans there from Manitoba, Minnesota, and Iowa that showed up at Les Bluffs in the winter. And this is a fabulous photo by Dan Staples of one of the GPS swans, you know, flying down there at Les Bluffs and a tree filled with eagles. That's a really cool photo. So 1H is the Manitoba swan we talked about earlier that was in northern Minnesota, you know, at the end of September. It was one of the early movers, and here it is down at Les Bluffs. Here are all the swans from Minnesota that showed up at Les Bluffs. And here's 5C, which is the Iowa swan. And here are all the Iowa cygnets that showed up at Les Bluffs. So here they all are. And I just want to point out, I showed you the 1C, which was that purple line for the Iowa. Well, 7P2, which was its cygnet right here, went to Les Bluffs while its parents and its siblings were like 50 miles away. So it just did not stay with its family. Later on, I think it went back with its family. I'm not going to play this for very long. This is Dan Staples had taken this. This is that Les Bluffs. So here you can what those collars look like, and those black things are panels, solar charging panels. And sometimes people say, gee, those collars are pretty tight. They look pretty tight, but they're not the size that fit the trumpeter swan. So in the wintertime when it's cold, the feathers of the neck fluff up. So again, that may look a little tight, but it's not. It's size specifically, you know, especially for the trumpeter swans. So now moving to Wisconsin, these are pretty interesting as well. So you see a large movement over here, and then you see that the Wisconsin birds, you know, for the most part went south. And again, this is going with, you know, with the latitude where it's colder, where they're going south. But one of the swans, 5P, was sort of a star of our swan conference that we had in 2022. So 5P showed up at Riverlands, which is right here. It's a great meeting place as well in Missouri. And one of the professors at St. Louis University followed that swan using the tracking map and followed that swan for a year and then presented his findings at the Swan Symposium we had in Jackson, and it was called Following 5P with Aristotelian Eye. So that was pretty cool. Just to kind of show you how quickly these birds move. So here's OP was a male swan. It was captured up here by Crex Meadows, and Crex Meadows is in kind of northwest Wisconsin. It was one of the original release sites for trumpeter swans. Well, 2 months after capture, it was down here in southern Indiana. So that was pretty quick movement where it went south. Other interesting thing that Wisconsin did, which I think was really cool, they actually put GPS collars on a family of siblings, cygnet siblings, and so rather than the parents. So they captured 1P, 2P, and 3P. And 1P got injured, and 2P and 3P then went with its parents. So they were captured here, and they both went straight down to Cape Girardeau, Illinois, and then back up again. So they stayed with their parents. But 1P sibling didn't. So she was injured and she was taken to a wildlife rehabber and then released at a different time. And she was released. This was her swan buddy that she was released with. That was another rehab swan. And you can see here, this is the purple line. So that bird just bopped around all over and actually ended up going to Ohio. So here were its siblings going down here with the parents. But this bird did not have a parent to show us the way, so it went all over and was exploring. And 4P was another swan, and it actually went up here to Manitoba. In Michigan, you could see these birds really didn't move around a lot here. So that's what was pretty interesting here is even these birds that were captured in the Upper Peninsula just kind of went across Lake Michigan here. They did not move the long distances that we saw with Manitoba and Minnesota and Wisconsin. And this one is pretty interesting. So 7K is a male, and I got a lot of reports about this where you can see it kind of stayed the same, but I got this might be a little less, but dollars left over from the Midwest Swans study. But you can see here the videos, swans, pictures as well. This is a close-up of Michigan, and these are some of the reports that I got. But I just want to point out, you can see these birds here in Michigan. These were their travels throughout the 3 years. So you can see they did not move. So compare that in your head to what we saw with, Manitoba, those long distances. So, I'm not sure if the water was open and food was good if they stayed there. But when David was talking about there, some of the swans stayed regional and local. These are some of those birds. In Ohio, that was pretty interesting too. So the first year they did it, most of these birds just stayed in Ohio, but you see there are these big movements here. And one of those big movements was 6M. And so we talked a little bit about molt migrations. And so I don't know if this was a molt migration or whatever, but this 6M was not a paired bird. So it was like unattached. And it went all the way up here to Manitoba. But 9N, which is this yellow line, was a paired, and it had actually had families before. And for some reason, it just took off to Ontario. And this is, I probably can't read it because something might be over it, but this was just the report that even Ohio DNR, where this bird was captured, wasn't sure why this bird made this long distance move during the summer, but it did return to Ohio. And then a couple of the Ohio birds actually went to Pennsylvania. And what's kind of cool about this bird 7M is 7M and 6M both were seen by a landowner on their same property, which was really pretty unusual and pretty cool. And then in Ohio, also, this was from Jody Thompson. So this is their farm. And here's 8N here on the farm. And also with 8N was this Virginia bird. So this bird was collared in Virginia, so like way down here. And Virginia actually has two collared swans in Ohio. So that was pretty interesting that, Jody had seen, as well as Larry Imhoff had seen, 8N along with this Virginia bird, in Ohio. So that was pretty cool. And Arkansas, we collared those birds in December of 2021, and because we wanted to see where they went. And then this is just showing that those Arkansas birds spent the summer up here in, Manitoba and Ontario. So those are, Manitoba actually had swans, from Wisconsin and Ohio and Arkansas, that showed up there in Manitoba and actually in Ontario as well. So if you want to see where that tracking website is, all you have to do, it's pretty easy, is just go to our home page, and there's a picture on there that says Report a Swan. It'll take you right to this Trumpeter Watch page. And you just go to the left sidebar, and if you just click on this or here, it'll take you right to that map. And here are some resources. This is actually, if you want to do a screenshot, this is actually the website for that tracking map. And then here's our website. So that's the end of my portion. So if you have any questions, we certainly would welcome them, and you can put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And before we get to those, just at the end, when we close out, just remember there's a very brief survey, which for me is just really important that you do. So go ahead, Jim. Were there any questions that came in? Whoops, I think you're muted. I can't hear you. Jeff, can you read those questions?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Jim, are you muted or are you all right?
He doesn't show that he's muted for some
Okay,
reason.
so there was some questions. We had about 10 questions come in. First one is talking about 200 swans that are overwintering on Lake Malilu by Hudson, Wisconsin. The question is, does the unusual warmth this fall account for the delay in that they haven't seen any this year so far? And whether there's any tracking information to show what's going on this fall?
David, I don't know if you want to answer, but I will say, Mike, the birds won't be coming until there's generally a cold spell. I mean, didn't you find it's kind of the cold weather that sort of is the impetus for swans being on the move. And I think
Yeah. Swans are so big and heavy, they can really withstand harsher conditions than most other waterfowl. So they're among the later ones to move. But we don't really have tracking data coming in anymore because due to cell phone companies always wanting better technology, towers have turned off their 3G bandwidth, which is what we use with these collars to transmit, and so that they could have 4G and 5G bandwidth. And so that unfortunately, we're not really getting much movement data coming in anymore from all the swans that were captured for the study.
Okay. Another question was whether there's any data showing that trumpeter swans mate with mute swans.
I'm not an expert on mute swans. I have heard that they can mate with each other. I don't know what the offspring are like. So if others want to jump in here, go ahead.
Well, we don't have Ken Abraham on here, but there have been a few instances where they are, but I think they're few and far between. It isn't like they're huge, numbers of that. So generally, I think that they, the species stick with themselves. I think occasionally there have been, certainly in Ontario.
Yeah, and mute swans are seen to outcompete trumpeters typically if they interact, and so I think it's more of a antagonistic relationship typically.
Hey, another person was looking for recommendations on books related to swan behavior and interested in knowing what research has been done on trumpeter swan vocalizations.
Well, on our website, you can find this probably under swan information. I probably have it on the FAQ. I know I have it on the FAQ page. I have a link to a paper by Harry Lumsden from Ontario about swan behavior, where he goes through, so it's a paper about when they vocalize, how they defend their young, and how they show aggression and that kind of thing. So Harry did, some of the work with that. I don't know that there's a specific book about it, but you can certainly find, some basic stuff on our website in the frequently asked question. It's swan information, FAQs, and then it's the left sidebar.
Okay, here's a question about for swans that succumb to lead levels in the wild and die in the field, do predators that eat the swans also suffer a buildup of their lead levels?
I would
That
imagine so. I don't
Yeah,
see why they wouldn't.
yeah. Just so you guys know, on December 11, we're actually having a big webinar. It's gonna be all about lead poisoning and swans. So, if we can't answer those questions here, you might want to mark your calendar for December 11 to be able to submit your questions there, because we're going to have some medical experts to talk about that. But there has been some thought that, that it can move up the food chain, if eagles, let's say, are whatever are eating, that maybe it's, you know, if they swallow that piece of lead that might be in a deer carcass or whatever, or, you know, in the gizzard, that lead, if it's a bird, would, you know, could stay in the gizzard of the next bird.
Okay. I'm sort of going through these. I know we're running short on time here. In the early 2000s, some southern Minnesota trumpeters, including breeders and family groups, were documented migrating south through Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, Arkansas, and finally overwintered in Texas. This person was wondering if most of these, or said if they recall that most of these adults originally were collared in Iowa. And then the follow-up is a comment, really. It's actually become quite common for Iowa collared swans to take up breeding residence in Minnesota, at least in southern Minnesota. And this person was wondering whether climate change is altering how far they now overwinter.
I would imagine so, yeah, for sure. And I think with Iowa, part of the issue is that they've destroyed almost all their wetlands, and so there might just be not as much good available breeding habitat, where Minnesota might have a lot more. So yeah, but I wouldn't see why climate wouldn't be pushing those overwintering locations further and further north. Yeah.
There's just a couple of comments that there on the 4th of January this past year, there was a record number of trumpeter swans seen at Les Bluffs, 4,200 trumpeters basically, and I saw those reports as well. So there's a growing number of trumpeters being counted there.
Jeff, can I just add one thing to that? If you guys live in the South, there are three great places to see swans in the South. One would be Les Bluffs, which is in Missouri. There's Riverlands, which is, you know, by St. Louis, and then Heber Springs, Arkansas. So those three places have large, you know, largest numbers of trumpeter swans. So if you want to do some swan viewing down there, those are three great places to go. Go ahead, Jeff.
Another comment that someone believes they saw 5 mute swan crosses on the Fort Hall bottoms in Idaho yesterday morning. Last question really here is there any information or knowledge of a swan, probably an adult male, terminating or killing one or more of its young? This person's witnessed this with a pair of swans that are on their lake in Traverse City, Michigan.
I don't know the answer to that. Jim, have you heard of anything like that?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I think they may attack the youngsters of other pairs, but I've certainly never heard of that. Not to say it hasn't happened, but
Yeah, I would say the same thing, that likely if there were swans of cygnets in addition to this one pair, they may be territorial and be aggressive toward cygnets from another pair. That'd be more likely. Okay, that's all the questions that I see.
just one more. Did we talk about what's going on this fall? I don't know if David has any information on that, but is there evidence that that things are kind of delayed, the migration's kind of delayed because of the warm fall we've had this year? Does anybody comment on that?
Yeah, I think that was the first question we had, where we're
Oh,
not
okay.
really getting much movement data coming in anymore for the project. And this wouldn't be a super late time anyway. Like, things haven't frozen yet. It doesn't really feel like winter in a lot of this range, so I'm not surprised if swans haven't showed up further south.
I know we've had, I think, record warm weather in much of the continent, so you can expect things to be a little bit late, I would think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. And again, I want to just point out that I'm really interested in you filling out the survey if you can. And, you know, thanks to David Wolfson for this great presentation, and Jeff and Jim and Tiffany for being part of this. And we hope to see you at the next one. So thank you.